If you run a podcast, you probably want to keep track of some analytics about how many people are listening to your podcast and which episodes are most popular. In this short video, I'm going to show you how to visualize that analytics using SquaredUp's Web API plugin, which lets you connect to any data you want, provided it returns the data in a JSON format. I host the Slight Reliability podcast on a podcast hosting provider called Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout is fairly popular, and if you use it, you can follow the process that I do to achieve the same result. Now, at the moment, if I want to go in and see how many people are listening to the podcast, I can go to the Buzzsprout website itself, which you can see here. You can see a list of each episode and how many times they've been downloaded or essentially listened to. There is also a stats page where you can see information over time about how many people are listening to the podcast, which is quite good. Where you can adjust the time frame that you want to see statistics for, including all time, which takes a little while to load. But you can't necessarily control everything, such as the sampling interval. For example, I might want to see my stats for all time, but I want to break it down by listens per month or listens per week. But I can't control that here, which is one limitation. The other thing is I need to come in and obviously log in to Buzzsprout to access this information. Luckily for me, Buzzsprout exposes an API, and this API provides information about your podcast and all the episodes that you've released, including how many times they've been downloaded. Now, just going through the GitHub documentation, you can see that the authentication is very simple. The only thing that you need to do is to pass in an auth token, either as a query string parameter or as part of an authorization header. The other thing worth noting is that we need to pass a GET request to this URL and pass in our specific podcast ID, which I'm going to grab in a second as well. And lastly, looking at the sample request here, we can see we need to make a request to episodes.json. That's the specific API endpoint that we need to call. So going back to Buzzsprout, we can see my podcast ID is here in the URL when I log in. So that's one part of the equation already solved. The second thing is I can go to settings, API key, and I can see my API key here. And I'm going to use this to authorize when I make API calls to Buzzsprout. Now, what I'm going to do next is completely optional, but it's just the way that I work. I want to test this API call out, not in SquaredUp, but in an API development tool called Postman. So here I have created the request as per the GitHub instructions to buzzsprout.com/API, my podcast ID, and then I've added a query string parameter called API_token with my token as the value. And if I click send, I get a response back. And the structure of the JSON is that it has an entry for each episode, which contains information about the episode. And one of the things included there is the total plays. So this one is 0 because I haven't released this episode yet. If I scroll down further, this episode has 41 plays. Go down a little further, this one has 119. So here is some analytics information that we want to know. And I can see by looking at the structure of this data that if I was to add up all of these different total plays values, it would give me the total number of downloads or listens across all episodes over all time, which is something of interest to me. Okay, I've switched into SquaredUp now. So what I want to do here is build a dashboard which gives me an overview of how my podcast is going. So the first thing I need to do is create a workspace. And I'm going to call it Buzzsprout API for demo. Leave everything else as it is. And now the first thing that we're going to have to do is to connect to some data so we have something to plot. So what I want to use is the Web API plugin, which, as I said, is a generic plugin which lets you connect to any API at all, provided it returns JSON data. So let's call it Buzzsprout API for demo. The URL we can get from Postman, which we just used before, to episodes.json. Yep. Now we know in advance that we're going to have to pass in an API key to authenticate. And I'm going to use a query string parameter to do that. And that is called API token. We'll switch back to Postman and I will use the token that we grabbed from Buzzsprout. Now we can test the endpoint. And here we can see the same data is coming back as we saw in Postman, so we know that this data source is now working. So let's add it. So we have a data source set up connecting to the Buzzsprout API specifically for the Slight Reliability podcast account. Now let's create a dashboard. Okay, we're going to connect to some data. We can pick the Buzzsprout API for demo, which we created before. Click next. Now, because of the way we've set up the data source, we don't need to change any other configuration here. We can send it and immediately see the same data that came back when we ran this in Postman. Now, you probably won't be able to see it unless I scroll way down to the bottom. But we have a bit of a problem here. We have episodes titled Performance Time, because I used to have another podcast called Performance Time, which was all about performance engineering before Slight Reliability, and all those episodes are actually part of the same Buzzsprout channel. But we want to exclude these from the numbers because I'm only interested in the Slight Reliability podcast. We do that by adding a filter. We want to choose the title, and we want to make sure the title doesn't contain performance time. There we go. So that has sorted that out. And the second thing we want to do is we want to sum up the total plays across all episodes, not just one episode. So let's add some aggregation here. The total of total plays. So we can see here 11,625 episode listens have occurred, and I can change this to get rid of the decimal points. So this is pretty much what I was after for this first panel. Let's give it a title. And click Save. So there we go. We have our first panel, which just gives us a number. This is the total number of listens of Slight Reliability episodes over all time. But what if I wanted to see what the most popular episodes were of all time based on the number of people who listened to them? Let's create that chart. So we'll add another column. We'll connect to some data, Buzzsprout API. This information about the request is fine. We don't need to change that. The y-axis, we don't want to look at the ID. We want to look at the total plays. There we go. And now to shaping, we want to once again filter out any episodes from performance time. And let's sort by total plays descending, and let's focus on the top 10 results. So now we have the chart that I was thinking about, and we can see that episode 2 was the most popular episode of all time. So let's save that and rearrange this. And rename it. So there we go. We have a very basic overview of the Slight Reliability podcast. There's one major limitation here, and that comes from the Buzzsprout API. The Buzzsprout API provides you downloads or listens for all time. You can't specify a time frame. So I couldn't look back and see how many episodes were listened to in the month of September in 2023, for example. That's not ideal, so my workaround is that each month I go in and manually take stock of how many listens have occurred and keep a record of that so I can see how it's changing month to month. One thing I'd like to do to extend this in the future is that I also release the podcast on YouTube. So I'd like to pull in my YouTube view numbers and have them alongside the Buzzsprout listen numbers to get the full picture of how many people are consuming the podcast. So there you go. If you use Buzzsprout as your podcast hosting provider, here's how you can pull together a simple dashboard about how your podcast is going. And hopefully I've illustrated the flexibility of the web API in terms of being able to connect to just about anything in the world to pull together the data you need to make good decisions.